The sun beat down merciless on the Dakota prairie as Violet Lawson dragged another bleached buffalo skull across the dried grass, her hands wrapped in strips of cloth that had long since worn through in places, leaving her palms raw and blistered. The year was 1883, and the great herds that once darkened the plains were gone, slaughtered for their hides and left to rot where they fell, their bones now the only commodity left for those desperate enough to gather them. She was 22 years old and alone in a world that had no mercy for women without men to protect them. But Violet had learned that survival meant doing whatever work presented itself, no matter how backbreaking or degrading others might find it. The wagon she had borrowed from the general store owner in Bismarck sat half full already, creaking under the weight of femurs and ribs and skulls, all destined for the fertilizer factories back east, where they would be ground down into bone meal. At $7 a ton, it was honest work, even if it meant spending her days among the ghosts of the magnificent creatures that had sustained the tribes for generations. Her father had been a buffalo hunter before the whiskey took him, and her mother had died of consumption the winter before, leaving Violet with nothing but a small claim shanty and the determination not to end up in one of the brothels that lined the rougher streets of town. She straightened her back with a wince, pressing her fist into the small of her spine where the muscles screamed in protest. The prairie stretched endlessly in every direction, dotted with the white monuments to extinction, and she had maybe another hour of good light before she would need to start the long walk back to town with her haul. The wind carried the smell of sage and dust, and somewhere in the distance a hawk cried out, circling on thermals invisible to human eyes. That was when she heard the horse approaching, the steady rhythm of hooves on hard ground unmistakable in the afternoon silence. Violet's hand went instinctively to the hunting knife she kept strapped to her belt, her eyes narrowing as she watched the rider materialize from the heat shimmer. Out here, alone and vulnerable, she could not afford to trust anyone, and there were men who would see a woman by herself as an opportunity rather than a person deserving of respect. The cowboy sat easy in his saddle, his hat pulled low against the sun, and as he drew closer, she could see he was young, probably not more than 25, with the lean build of someone who spent long days in the saddle. His horse was a good one, a bay gelding with clean legs and an intelligent eye, and his gear was well maintained but not fancy. He raised one hand in greeting as he approached, making no sudden movements that might alarm her. "Afternoon, miss," he called out, his voice carrying across the distance between them. "That is some hard work you are doing there." Violet did not relax her stance, though she nodded in acknowledgement. "It is honest work and it pays." He reined his horse to a stop about 10 feet away, close enough to talk but far enough to show he respected her space. Up close she could see his face more clearly, the strong jaw shadowed with stubble, the startling blue eyes that seemed to take in everything without judgment. There was something kind in his expression, but she had learned that kindness could be a mask men wore until they got what they wanted. "Name is Xavier Owens," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "I work for the Cross T Ranch, about 15 miles west of here. I have been tracking a few head of cattle that wandered off during the last storm." "Violet Lawson," she replied, her tone still guarded. "I have not seen any cattle out this way, just bones." He swung down from his saddle with the fluid grace of someone who had been born to the work, ground tying his horse with a simple drop of the reins. She tensed slightly, but he made no move toward her, instead walking over to examine the wagon with what appeared to be genuine interest. "Buffalo bones," he said, running his hand along one of the massive skulls. My grandfather used to tell stories about when the herds were so thick you could not see the horizon through them. Hard to believe it now, looking at what is left. Hard to believe a lot of things, Violet said, wiping the sweat from her forehead with the back of her arm. But the bones are worth money, and I need to eat. Xavier turned to look at her, and she saw something shift in his expression, a softening around the eyes that made her throat tighten unexpectedly. "There is easier work here," he said quietly. "The Cross T is looking for a cook. The last one quit after the foreman made one too many complaints about his biscuits. It is steady pay, room and board, and you would not be breaking your back dragging bones across the prairie in the heat." Violet's first instinct was to refuse, to tell this stranger that she did not need his charity or his pity. But the words died on her lips as she looked down at her ruined hands, felt the ache in every muscle of her body. Pride was a luxury she could not afford, not when winter was coming and her shanty barely kept out the wind. Still, she hesitated, knowing that accepting help always came with strings attached. "Why would you offer that to someone you just met?" she asked, suspicion creeping into her voice. "You do not know anything about me. I could be a terrible cook. I could be running from the law." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, the first real expression of warmth she had seen from him. "You could be," he agreed, "but I have spent enough time around people to get a sense of them. You have honest eyes, and anyone willing to work this hard is not looking for an easy way out. As for your cooking, well, it would be hard to do worse than old Frank, and the boys ran him off last week anyway. We are desperate enough that even passable cooking would be an improvement." Despite herself, Violet felt an answering smile trying to form on her own lips, though she fought it back. "I can cook," she admitted. "My mother taught me before she passed, but I do not know anything about feeding a bunkhouse full of cowboys. It is mostly just making a lot of whatever you would make for a regular family," Xavier said. "Beans, bacon, beef when we slaughter, bread, coffee strong enough to strip paint. Nothing fancy. And the foreman, Jake, he is a good man. He would not let anyone give you trouble." The offer was tempting, more tempting than Violet wanted to admit. The thought of sleeping in a real bed again, of having regular meals and not worrying about whether she could gather enough bones to pay for supplies, made something in her chest ache with longing. But there was also fear there, the knowledge that once she accepted this kind of help, she would be beholden to these men, dependent on their goodwill and subject to their whims. "I would need to think about it," she said finally, though even as she spoke she knew she would accept. There really was no choice, not if she wanted to survive the coming winter. Xavier nodded as if he had expected that answer. "The ranch is not going anywhere," he said. "But if you decide you are interested, come out to the Cross T and ask for me or Jake Morrison. We will set you up with everything you need." He moved back to his horse, gathering the reins with an easy motion, and Violet found herself watching the way he moved, the confident economy of gesture that spoke of a man comfortable in his own skin. He swung back up into the saddle and looked down at her, that same gentle expression on his face. "For what it is worth, Miss Lawson, I hope you will come. It is not right, you out here doing this kind of work alone. Everyone deserves better than that." Before she could formulate a response, he touched his hat brim again and turned his horse, cantering off across the prairie in the direction he had come. Violet stood there watching until he disappeared into the distance, her heart beating faster than the heat alone could account for, her mind already turning over the implications of what he had offered. She spent the rest of the afternoon gathering bones, but her heart was not in it anymore. The work that had seemed necessary, and even noble that morning now felt futile, a losing battle against poverty and loneliness that would eventually grind her down no matter how hard she struggled. By the time she had loaded the last skull into the wagon and begun the long walk back to Bismarck, leading the borrowed mules by their halter, her mind was made up. The general store owner, a portly man named Henderson who had known her father, weighed the bones and paid her $4.30 for her efforts. It was less than she had hoped for, barely enough to cover the cost of renting the wagon and mules and buy a few supplies. As she walked back to her shanty at the edge of town, the coins heavy in her pocket, Violet made her decision. She would give notice to the few people who needed to know, pack what little she owned, and ride out to the Cross T Ranch in the morning. That night, she lay awake in the darkness, listening to the wind rattle the loose boards of her shanty walls, and thought about Xavier Owens and his kind blue eyes. She told herself it was foolish to read anything into a simple job offer, that he had probably just been being decent to someone in need. But she could not quite shake the feeling that something had shifted when their eyes met across that sun-baked prairie. It was a dangerous feeling, one she could not afford to indulge, but it was there nonetheless, warming her from the inside even as the night air grew cold. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the sky that particular shade of blue that seemed to exist nowhere else but the high plains. Violet packed her few belongings into a canvas bag, locked the shanty door behind her, and used the last of her money to rent a horse from the livery. The stable hand gave her directions to the Cross T, and by mid-morning she was riding west out of Bismarck, her heart alternately soaring with hope and plummeting with fear. The ranch, when she finally reached it, was larger than she had expected. The main house was a sprawling structure of logs and stone, with a wide porch that wrapped around 3 sides and windows that caught the afternoon sun. The bunkhouse stood off to one side, and beyond it she could see the barn, the corrals, the cookhouse, and various other outbuildings that spoke of a successful operation. Cattle dotted the landscape in every direction, sleek and healthy-looking, and she could see several cowboys working in the near corrals. She had barely dismounted when a man emerged from the main house, older than Xavier, with silver threading through his dark hair and the weathered face of someone who had spent a lifetime outdoors. He walked with a slight limp, favoring his left leg, and his eyes were shrewd as they took her in. "Help you, miss?" he asked, his tone neutral but not unfriendly. "I am looking for Xavier Owens," Violet said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Or Jake Morrison. My name is Violet Lawson. Xavier said there might be work here for a cook." Understanding dawned on the man's face, and he smiled, transforming his rather stern features into something much warmer. "I am Jake Morrison. Xavier mentioned he might have found someone. Come on, let me show you the cookhouse and we will see if we can work something out." Relief flooded through her, and she followed Jake across the yard, aware of the curious looks from the cowboys who had paused in their work to watch. The cookhouse was a long building with a massive iron stove dominating one end, a long table running down the center, and shelves lined with supplies along the walls. It was better equipped than anywhere Violet had ever cooked, and she felt a flutter of excitement mixed with nervousness. "The work is pretty straightforward," Jake explained, gesturing around the space. "Breakfast before dawn, dinner at noon, supper after the evening work is done. The boys are not picky, they just want hot food and plenty of it. You would have your own room off the back here, and we pay $30 a month plus room and board. Sundays you get the afternoon off after dinner cleanup. $30 a month." It was more money than Violet had seen in one place in years, more than she could make in 6 months of gathering bones. She tried not to let her desperation show, tried to maintain some semblance of dignity as she nodded. "That sounds fair," she said. "When would you want me to start?" "How about right now?" Jake said with a grin. "The boys are going to be coming in hungry in about 3 hours, and it would be nice to have something better than the slop we have been making ourselves to feed them." Violet smiled, a real smile this time, and set down her bag. "Then I better get started." The next few hours passed in a blur of activity as she familiarized herself with the kitchen, took stock of the supplies, and started preparing what would be her first meal for the ranch hands. She made a simple beef stew, thick with potatoes and carrots from the root cellar, and batch after batch of biscuits that came out of the oven golden and fluffy. By the time the cowboys started filing in, drawn by the smells coming from the cookhouse, she had coffee boiling and everything ready to serve. She counted 15 men in total, ranging in age from boys barely out of their teens to grizzled veterans who had probably been working cattle since before she was born. They were dusty and tired, and they filled the cookhouse with the smell of horse and sweat and leather, but their manners were impeccable as Jake introduced her. "Boys, this is Miss Violet Lawson, our new cook. I expect you all to treat her with respect and keep your complaints to yourself, unless you want to go back to making your own meals." There was a chorus of polite greetings, and then Xavier walked through the door, his eyes finding hers immediately across the crowded room. The smile that lit his face made her stomach flip, and she had to look away quickly, busying herself with ladling stew into bowls. The meal was a success, judging by the way the men cleaned their plates and came back for seconds and thirds. She heard compliments on the biscuits, appreciation for the fact that the stew actually had flavor, and general relief that they would no longer have to choke down burned beans and raw in the middle cornbread. As the men filed out, heading back to their afternoon work, several of them thanked her personally, and she felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the heat from the stove. Xavier lingered after the others had gone, helping her clear the table without being asked. She was hyper-aware of his presence, the way he moved around the space, the occasional brush of his hand against hers as they worked. Finally, when the last dish was washed and put away, he turned to face her directly. "I am glad you came," he said simply. "I was hoping you would." Violet felt heat rise in her cheeks, and she twisted the dish towel in her hands to give them something to do. "I needed the work," she said, trying to sound practical, trying not to read too much into his words. "It was a good offer." "It was a selfish offer," Xavier admitted, his blue eyes serious. "I wanted a reason to see you again." Her breath caught in her throat, and for a moment she could not think of a single thing to say. Men had expressed interest in her before, usually crude and unwelcome, but this was different. There was something genuine in Xavier's tone, something vulnerable that made her own defenses start to crumble. "You do not even know me," she whispered. "Then I would like to get to know you," he said, "if you would let me." Before she could answer, the cookhouse door banged open and one of the younger cowboys stuck his head in. "Xavier, Jake needs you at the south pasture. One of the heifers is having trouble calving." Xavier sighed but nodded. "I will be right there." He looked back at Violet, and there was a promise in his eyes. "We will talk more later," she nodded, not trusting her voice, and watched him go, her heart pounding so hard she was sure he must be able to hear it from across the yard. The days that followed fell into a comfortable rhythm. Violet rose before dawn to start breakfast, spending her mornings in the steamy warmth of the cookhouse, her hands busy with familiar tasks. She learned the preferences of the different men, who liked their coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in, and who preferred extra gravy on their biscuits. She learned the rhythms of ranch life, the way the work ebbed and flowed with the seasons and the needs of the cattle. And she learned about Xavier Owens, in pieces and moments stolen between the demands of their respective jobs. She learned that he had grown up in Texas, the son of a ranch hand who had died when he was 15, leaving him to support his mother and two younger sisters. She learned that he had worked his way north, saving every penny until he could send for his family and set them up in a small house in Bismarck, where his mother took in sewing, and his sisters attended the school. She learned that he was 24 years old, that he had a way with horses that bordered on magical, and that his greatest dream was to someday have a ranch of his own. He sought her out whenever he could, finding excuses to linger after meals or to stop by the cookhouse during the day on some errand or another. They talked about everything and nothing, their conversations ranging from the practical details of their lives to deeper questions about what they wanted from the future. Violet found herself opening up to him in ways she had never opened up to anyone, sharing the pain of losing her parents, the fear and loneliness of the past year, the dreams she had almost been afraid to acknowledge even to herself. 3 weeks after she had arrived at the Cross T, Xavier asked her to go riding with him on her Sunday afternoon off. She accepted with a mixture of excitement and nervousness, changing out of her work dress into the only other outfit she owned, a simple skirt and shirtwaist that had seen better days but was at least clean and mended. He was waiting for her with 2 horses already saddled, his face lighting up when he saw her. "I thought we could ride out to the creek," he said. "It is pretty this time of year, and there is a spot I want to show you." They rode out together, the horses walking side by side, and Violet felt a sense of freedom she had not experienced in longer than she could remember. The prairie stretched around them, golden in the late summer sun, and the sky seemed impossibly vast and blue. Xavier pointed out landmarks and told her stories about the ranch, about the various adventures and misadventures that came with cowboy life, and she laughed more than she had in years. The creek, when they reached it, was a ribbon of silver cutting through the grassland, lined with cottonwoods that provided welcome shade. Xavier dismounted and helped her down, his hands strong and steady on her waist, and for a moment they stood close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. Then he stepped back, giving her space, and gestured to a flat rock near the water's edge. They sat together, watching the water flow past, and the silence between them was comfortable, companionable. Finally, Xavier spoke, his voice quiet and serious. "I have been thinking a lot these past few weeks," he said, "about what I want where I am going. I always thought I needed to have everything figured out, needed to have my own ranch and be established before I could even think about settling down." Violet's heart started to beat faster, but she kept her eyes on the water, afraid to look at him, afraid of what she might see in his face. "But then I met you," he continued, "and I realized that all the success in the world would not mean anything if I did not have someone to share it with. Someone who understands what it is to work hard, to struggle, to keep going even when things are difficult." He reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers, and she finally turned to look at him. The expression on his face made her breath catch, so much vulnerability and hope and something that looked very much like love. "I know it has only been a few weeks," he said. "I know it is fast, maybe too fast. But Violet, I am falling in love with you. I think I started falling the moment I saw you out there on the prairie, refusing to give up even when the world had given you every reason to. And I would like the chance to court you properly, if you would let me. I would like to see where this could go." Tears stung Violet's eyes, happy tears, the kind she had almost forgotten existed. She squeezed his hand, her thumb brushing over his knuckles, and smiled through the blur. "I am falling in love with you too," she whispered. "And yes, Xavier. Yes, I would like that very much." He pulled her close then, his arms wrapping around her, and she leaned into his embrace, feeling safe and cherished for the first time in as long as she could remember. They sat like that for a long time, holding each other as the creek burbled past and the cottonwood leaves whispered overhead, and Violet felt something in her heart heal. Some wound she had not even known was there beginning to close. The courtship that followed was sweet and proper, conducted under the watchful but approving eyes of Jake and the other ranch hands. Xavier would bring her wildflowers he picked on his rides, would help her carry water from the well even though it was not his job, would sit with her on the cookhouse steps in the evening and talk until the stars came out. He kissed her for the first time a month later, a gentle brush of lips that set her whole body tingling, and from that moment on Violet knew with absolute certainty that she wanted to spend the rest of her life with this man. The summer turned to fall, and the work on the ranch intensified as they prepared for the roundup and the drive to the railhead. Violet watched Xavier leave with the other men, her heart heavy with worry but also proud of the way he sat his horse, the way the other cowboys respected his judgment and skill. The week he was gone felt like an eternity, but when he returned, dusty and exhausted and grinning from ear to ear, the first thing he did was sweep her into his arms and spin her around right there in the ranch yard, not caring who saw. Winter came early that year, the first snows falling in October, and with it came the forced intimacy of people confined to close quarters by the weather. The ranch hands spent more time in the cookhouse, drawn by the warmth of the stove and the good food and the cheerful presence of the woman who had become like a little sister to some of them, and a good friend to all. Violet bloomed under the attention, the feeling of being part of a family again after so long alone, and she could see that Xavier was loved and respected by the men he worked with, which only made her love him more. On Christmas Eve, with snow falling softly outside and the cookhouse filled with the smell of the special meal she had prepared, Xavier asked her to marry him. He did it in front of everyone, dropping to one knee beside her chair at the head of the table, producing a simple gold band that he said had belonged to his grandmother. His voice shook slightly as he asked the question, and there were tears in his eyes that matched the ones streaming down her face as she said yes. The wedding took place in Bismarck on New Year's Day, 1884, in the small church at the center of town. Xavier's mother and sisters were there, welcoming Violet into their family with genuine warmth and affection. Jake stood up as Xavier's best man, and one of the other ranch hands escorted Violet down the aisle since she had no family of her own left to do it. It was a simple ceremony, but it was perfect, and when the preacher pronounced them man and wife and Xavier kissed her, Violet felt like her heart might burst from happiness. They spent their wedding night in the hotel in Bismarck, a luxury they could barely afford but one that Xavier insisted on. He was gentle with her, patient and loving, and the intimacy they shared that night only deepened the bond between them. Afterward, lying in his arms in the darkness, Violet thought about how far she had come from that day on the prairie, dragging buffalo bones in the heat, convinced she would die alone and unmourned. Life had given her a second chance, and she was determined not to waste it. They returned to the Cross T the next day, and Violet went back to her work in the cookhouse while Xavier returned to his duties with the cattle. But everything was different now, sweeter somehow, knowing that at the end of each day they would be together. Jake had given them permission to fix up one of the unused line shacks about a mile from the main ranch, and they spent their free time making it into a real home, patching the roof and chinking the walls and building furniture from rough lumber. By spring, Violet knew she was pregnant. The realization filled her with a mixture of joy and terror, memories of her own mother's difficult pregnancies and early death haunting her dreams. But Xavier was over the moon with excitement, treating her like she was made of glass, insisting she cut back on the heavy work in the cookhouse. Jake hired a young man from town to help with the cooking, taking some of the burden off Violet's shoulders, and she spent more time in their little cabin, sewing baby clothes and preparing for the new life that would join them. The baby, a boy they named James after Xavier's father, was born in November during a howling blizzard that trapped them in the cabin for 3 days. The local midwife could not get through the snow, and Xavier had to deliver his son himself with only the vaguest idea of what he was doing and Violet coaching him through her labor pains. It was terrifying and messy and beautiful, and when he finally placed the squalling infant in her arms, both of them crying and laughing at the same time, Violet thought she had never seen her husband look more proud or more scared. Being a mother was harder than anything Violet had ever done, harder even than dragging buffalo bones across the prairie in the summer heat. James was a fussy baby, colicky and demanding, and there were nights when she walked the floor with him for hours, too exhausted to even cry anymore, wondering if she was doing everything wrong. But Xavier was there through all of it, taking the baby when he came in from work so she could sleep, changing diapers and walking the floor himself when she was too tired to stand, never complaining about the disruption to his rest. As James grew from infant to toddler, the little family found its rhythm. Violet went back to work in the cookhouse part-time, bringing James with her and setting up a play area in the corner where he could toddle around under her watchful eye. The cowboys doted on the boy, teaching him to say horse and cow before he could manage mama or papa, and it became a running joke that James would grow up thinking Jake was his grandfather and the bunkhouse his natural habitat. Xavier continued to work hard, saving every penny he could toward his dream of owning his own ranch. In the spring of 1886, when James was 1.5 years old, opportunity knocked in the form of a neighboring rancher who wanted to sell out and move back east to be near his aging parents. The property was not large, only about 300 acres with a small house and barn, but it had good water and grazing, and the price was fair. Xavier came to Violet with the news, his eyes bright with excitement but also uncertainty. It would mean taking on debt, he said. It would mean years of hard work with no guarantee of success, and it would mean leaving the security of the Cross T. I would not do it if you were not comfortable with the risk. Violet looked at her husband, at the hope and ambition written across his face, and then looked at their son playing with wooden blocks on the floor. She thought about the life they had built together, about how far they had both come from their separate struggles and loneliness. And she thought about the future, about what they could build together if they were brave enough to try. "We have been through worse," she said, taking his hand, "and we did it alone. Together we can do anything." The next few months were a whirlwind of activity. They said emotional goodbyes to Jake and the Cross T crew, who threw them a party and gave them gifts of furniture and tools and livestock to help them get started. They moved into the small house on their new property, which needed work, but had good bones and a spectacular view of the surrounding prairie. Xavier spent his days repairing fences and buildings, while Violet kept house and garden and looked after James, who was now walking and getting into everything. Money was tight, tighter than it had been even during Violet's bone-gathering days, but there was a satisfaction in the struggle that had been absent from that earlier hardship. This was building something, creating a legacy for their son and the children they hoped would follow. When the work was overwhelming and the finances looked impossible, they held each other in the darkness and reminded themselves why they were doing this. Their first roundup was a disaster, with half the cattle escaping through a break in the fence that Xavier had not yet gotten around to fixing. Their first attempt at selling beef to the army fort ended with them getting cheated by a crooked middleman who paid half what he had promised. There were times when Violet wondered if they had made a terrible mistake, if they should have stayed at the Cross T where life was comfortable and secure. But there were also victories. The garden Violet planted flourished beyond her wildest expectations, providing enough vegetables to see them through the winter with plenty left over to sell in town. Xavier's skill with horses earned them extra money breaking and training mounts for other ranchers. And slowly, painfully, the ranch began to turn a profit, small at first but growing as they learned and adapted and refused to give up. In the fall of 1887, Violet discovered she was pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, perhaps because she knew what to expect or perhaps because she was stronger now, toughened by the years of hard work. Their daughter, Mary, was born in May of 1888, delivered by the same midwife who had been snowed out for James's birth. She was a placid baby, so different from her colicky brother that Violet and Xavier joked she must have been switched at birth. With 2 children and the ranch demanding constant attention, life became even more hectic. Violet learned to cook with a baby on her hip and a toddler wrapped around her legs. Xavier worked from before dawn until after dark, pushing himself to the point of exhaustion and beyond. But there was joy in it too, in watching their children grow, in seeing the ranch take shape according to their vision, in the quiet moments they stole together when the children were asleep, and they could just be husband and wife again instead of parents and ranchers. The winter of 1889 was brutal, with temperatures dropping so low that cattle froze standing up, and even the well water turned to ice. They lost a quarter of their herd, devastating financially but not catastrophic, and only Xavier's foresight in building a solid barn saved the rest. They huddled together in the house, the whole family sleeping in one room to conserve heat, and Violet was reminded of those nights alone in her shanty outside Bismarck, wondering if she would survive until spring. But this time she was not alone, and that made all the difference. Spring brought renewal, as it always did, and with it came the news that the railroad was extending a line closer to their area, which would make shipping cattle easier and more profitable. Xavier immediately began making plans to take advantage of the new opportunity, talking with other local ranchers about forming a cooperative to negotiate better prices. Violet watched him come alive in these discussions, saw the natural leader he was becoming, and felt a surge of pride in the man she had married. The years rolled past, each bringing its own challenges and triumphs. James started school in Bismarck, riding in with Xavier when he went to town for supplies and staying with Xavier's mother during the week. Mary grew into a serious, thoughtful child who loved to help her mother in the garden and could often be found talking to the chickens as if they were her closest confidants. Xavier's ranch, the X-Bar-O as they had named it, grew and prospered, becoming known throughout the territory for the quality of its beef and the integrity of its owners. In 1891, Violet gave birth to twin boys, Joseph and William, who arrived a month early and scared 10 years off both their parents' lives. But they were fighters, those two, and they survived and thrived, growing into wild, energetic children who kept Violet running from morning to night. The house that had seemed so spacious when they first moved in now felt cramped with 6 people, and Xavier started making plans to add on, drawing up designs in the evening by lamplight while Violet darned socks and the children did their lessons. The addition was completed in the spring of 1892, giving them 2 more bedrooms and a proper parlor where they could entertain the neighbors who had become their friends. Violet planted flowers around the new porch, creating a riot of color that brightened the stark prairie landscape. Standing there looking at the house, at the thriving garden, at the children playing in the yard, and the cattle dotting the pastures beyond, she had to pinch herself sometimes to believe it was all real. She and Xavier still talked sometimes about that day they met, out on the prairie with the buffalo bones scattered around them like monuments to a vanished world. He would tease her about how suspicious she had been, how she had looked at him like he might be a bandit planning to rob her of her wagon load of bones. She would remind him that he had been pretty forward, offering a job to a complete stranger, and he would pull her close and say it was the best decision he had ever made. In 1893, North Dakota achieved statehood, and the territory they had known was transformed into something new and more permanent. It felt fitting somehow, the formalization of the community and the land that had given them so much. Xavier was asked to serve on the county council, a recognition of the respect he had earned among his neighbors, and though it meant more time away from the ranch, he accepted out of a sense of duty to the place that had become their home. Violet, too, found ways to contribute to the growing community. She started a women's circle that met monthly, bringing together the scattered ranch wives for fellowship and mutual support. She taught cooking classes for young brides who had come west with romantic notions but little practical knowledge. And she never forgot what it was like to be desperate and alone, and so she always had a meal and a listening ear for anyone who came to her door in need. The turn of the century found the Owens family prosperous and happy, their ranch one of the most successful in the area. James, now 16, was already taller than his father and showed every sign of becoming an excellent rancher himself. Mary, at 12, was the image of her mother, with the same determined chin and kind eyes. The twins, rambunctious 9-year-olds, kept everyone on their toes with their endless energy and inventive mischief. On a summer evening in 1900, Violet and Xavier sat on the porch of their expanded house, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and gold. The children were doing evening chores, their voices carrying across the yard, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its mate. Xavier had his arm around Violet's shoulders, and she leaned into him, comfortable and content. "You ever think about what your life would have been like if we had never met?" Xavier asked, his voice thoughtful in the gathering dusk. Violet considered the question seriously, as she always did when he asked something. "I try not to," she admitted. "I think I would have died that winter or maybe ended up in one of the brothels in Bismarck. There was nowhere else for me to go, no other options." Xavier tightened his arm around her. "You would have found a way," he said firmly. "You are the strongest person I know. You would have survived." "Maybe," Violet allowed, "but surviving is not the same as living, and all of this is living." She gestured at the ranch, the family, the life they had built together. "I think about it sometimes," Xavier confessed. "About how close I came to just riding past you that day. I had spotted my cattle in the distance, and I was in a hurry to round them up before they wandered too far. But something made me stop, made me talk to you. I still do not know what it was." "Fate," Violet said simply. "Or providence, or whatever you want to call it. We were meant to find each other, meant to build this life together." They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching as the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky. Finally, Xavier spoke again, his voice soft and full of emotion. "You know what I remember most about that day? Not how hard you were working or how beautiful you were, though both those things were true. What I remember is the look in your eyes. You were not asking for pity or help, you were just doing what needed to be done. That is when I knew. Knew what? Violet asked, though she thought she knew the answer. That you were someone special, someone worth knowing, worth loving, someone I could build a life with. He turned to look at her, and even after all these years, the love in his eyes still made her breath catch. I was right, you know. You are all those things and more. Violet felt tears sting her eyes, happy tears, the kind that came from being so full of love and gratitude that it had to overflow somehow. I love you, she whispered. I have loved you since that first day, I think, even though I was too scared to admit it. I love you too, Xavier said. And then he kissed her, soft and sweet. A kiss that held all the years between that first meeting and this moment, all the struggles and triumphs, all the love and commitment that had sustained them through everything. When they finally pulled apart, the stars were out in full force, a canopy of light stretching from horizon to horizon. From inside the house, they could hear the children getting ready for bed, the familiar sounds of home and family. And Violet thought about how far they had both come, from lonely, struggling individuals to this, a family and a ranch and a future bright with promise. The years continued to pass, bringing changes as they always did. James married a schoolteacher from Bismarck in 1904, a smart, pretty girl named Sarah who fit into the family as if she had always been there. They built a house on the far corner of the ex-Barrow property, and James took over more and more of the day-to-day ranch operations, allowing Xavier to slow down a bit as age and old injuries began to catch up with him. Mary surprised everyone by announcing that she wanted to go to college, an almost unheard-of ambition for a ranch girl in 1905. But Xavier and Violet had always believed in education, and they scraped together the money to send her to the state university, where she studied agriculture and came home full of new ideas about crop rotation and soil conservation. She eventually married a fellow student, a young man from Fargo who was willing to learn the ranching business, and they settled on a section of land adjacent to the ex-Barrow. The twins went in different directions, as twins often do. Joseph stayed on the ranch, content to work with his hands and his horses, while William was drawn to town life and eventually opened a mercantile in Bismarck. But both remained close to their parents and to each other, and family gatherings were loud, boisterous affairs filled with grandchildren and laughter. In 1910, Xavier and Violet celebrated their 26th wedding anniversary with a big party attended by what felt like half the county. Looking around at the crowd, at the grown children and the grandchildren, at the friends and neighbors who had become like family, Violet was overwhelmed with gratitude for the life they had built. Xavier, now 51 and showing silver at his temples, still looked at her with the same love and warmth he had shown that first day on the prairie, and she knew that her love for him had only grown deeper and stronger with time. They were sitting together later that evening after most of the guests had gone home, when Xavier brought up a subject they had discussed before but never seriously pursued. "I was thinking," he said carefully, "that maybe it is time we took a real trip, somewhere we have never been. Maybe even see the ocean." Violet looked at him in surprise. In all their years together, they had rarely left the area around Bismarck, both because of the demands of the ranch and because money had always been tight. But things were different now, more stable, and the children were more than capable of handling things for a few weeks. "The ocean," she repeated, testing the idea. "I have only seen pictures in books." "We could go to California," Xavier said, warming to the topic. "Take the train, see some of the country. We have worked hard all our lives, Violet. I think we have earned a little adventure." She smiled at him, at the boyish enthusiasm on his weathered face. "Then let us do it," she said. "Let us go see the ocean." They made the trip in the spring of 1911, boarding the train in Bismarck and watching the landscape change from prairie to mountains to desert and finally to the lush California coast. Violet stood on the beach in San Francisco with her shoes in her hand and her skirt hitched up, feeling the ocean waves wash over her feet, and laughed with pure joy. Xavier stood beside her, his own feet bare, and they held hands like young sweethearts instead of middle-aged ranchers with grown children. The trip was everything they had dreamed of and more, a chance to be just themselves without the weight of responsibility and routine. They stayed in hotels and ate in restaurants and saw sights they had only read about in newspapers. But as wonderful as it all was, Violet found herself getting homesick after a few weeks, missing the sweep of the prairie and the familiar routines of ranch life. Xavier felt the same, and they cut their trip short by a few days, eager to get back to North Dakota and the land and the family they loved. The ranch welcomed them back with open arms, and Violet realized that this was where she belonged, where she had always been meant to be. Not in some distant city or exotic location, but here, in this place that she and Xavier had built together from nothing but determination and love. In 1915, the world was changing in ways that felt threatening and uncertain. War raged in Europe, though America had not yet been drawn in, and there were rumors of shortages and conscription. Xavier was too old to worry about being called up, but James was 31, and Joseph was 24, both prime age for military service. Violet tried not to think about it, tried to focus on the everyday work of life, but the worry was always there, lurking at the edges of her consciousness. When America did enter the war in 1917, both James and Joseph volunteered, refusing to wait to be drafted. It was the hardest thing Violet had ever endured, watching her sons ride off to war, not knowing if they would return. Xavier tried to be strong for her, but she could see the fear in his eyes, the same fear she felt every moment of every day. The months that followed were agonizing. They received occasional letters, heavily censored, that told them little except that their sons were still alive. Violet threw herself into war work, organizing drives to collect supplies for the soldiers, knitting socks and scarves until her fingers ached. Xavier kept the ranch running with the help of Mary's husband and William, who had been classified as essential to the home front because of his mercantile. When the armistice finally came in November of 1918, Violet wept with relief. And when both James and Joseph returned home safely the following spring, thinner and quieter and changed in ways both subtle and profound, she held them and thanked God for bringing them back to her. The war had taken its toll, and it would be years before either man could talk about what they had experienced, but they were alive and home, and that was all that mattered. The 1920s brought prosperity to the ranch and to the region. Prices for beef were good, and new technologies like tractors and improved breeding stock made the work easier and more productive. Xavier, now in his 60s, was content to let James run things while he focused on his grandchildren, and the garden Violet had expanded over the years. He had slowed down considerably, his old injuries and a lifetime of hard work catching up with him, but he was happy, surrounded by family and secure in the knowledge that everything they had built would continue long after they were gone. Violet herself was 59 years old in 1925, her hair gone completely gray and her hands showing the marks of decades of hard work. But she still rose early every morning, still kept house and garden with the same dedication she had brought to the cookhouse at the Cross T all those years ago. Her children worried that she worked too hard, tried to get her to slow down, but she would just laugh and tell them she would rest when she was dead. On a golden afternoon in September of 1925, Violet was picking tomatoes in her garden when Xavier came out to find her. He moved slowly now, using a cane to steady himself, but his smile was the same as it had always been. He sat on the bench he had built at the edge of the garden, watching her work with evident pleasure. "You remember the first meal you cooked at the Cross T?" he asked suddenly. Violet straightened up, pressing her hand to the small of her back, and smiled at the memory. "Beef stew and biscuits. I was so nervous I thought I might be sick. I had never cooked for that many people before." "It was the best meal I had eaten in months," Xavier said. "Maybe the best meal I had ever eaten. I knew right then that I was going to marry you." "You did not," Violet protested, laughing. "You barely knew my name." "I knew enough," Xavier insisted. "I knew you were beautiful and capable, and that you made my heart beat faster when you smiled." That seemed like enough to build on. Violet abandoned her tomatoes and went to sit beside him on the bench, taking his weathered hand in hers. "We built a good life, did we not?" she asked softly. "The best life," Xavier agreed. "Better than I ever dreamed possible." He was quiet for a moment, then said, "I have been thinking lately about that day I found you collecting buffalo bones, about how you were working so hard to survive, refusing to give up even when you had every reason to. That is what I fell in love with, you know. Not just how you looked, but who you were, strong and determined and unwilling to be defeated." "You saw something in me that I did not see in myself," Violet said. "You gave me hope when I had none left. You saved my life, Xavier Owens." "No," Xavier said firmly. "We saved each other. I was drifting before I met you, just going through the motions. You gave me purpose, gave me a reason to build something permanent. We did it together, Violet. Every bit of it." They sat in comfortable silence, holding hands and watching the sun paint the sky in shades of amber and rose. Around them, the ranch hummed with life, their children and grandchildren going about their business, the cattle lowing in the distance, the wind whispering through the prairie grass. It was the sound of home, of family, of a legacy that would endure. Xavier's health began to decline in the winter of 1926. It started with a persistent cough that would not go away, then progressed to weakness and fatigue that no amount of rest seemed to cure. The doctor in Bismarck examined him and gave Violet the news she had been dreading: pneumonia complicated by years of working in all weather and old injuries that had never quite healed. There was nothing to be done but keep him comfortable and hope. Violet nursed him through that winter with a fierce dedication, rarely leaving his side. The children took turns sitting with their father, and the grandchildren came to visit, bringing brief smiles to Xavier's face even as he grew weaker. Through it all, Violet held his hand, told him stories about their life together, reminded him of all the good they had created. On a cold night in February of 1927, with snow falling softly outside and Violet dozing in the chair beside his bed, Xavier Owens drew his last breath. He went peacefully, a small smile on his face, and when Violet woke and realized he was gone, she felt her heart break even as she understood that his suffering was over. The funeral was attended by what seemed like the entire county, a testament to the respect and affection Xavier had earned over his lifetime. He was buried in the small cemetery outside Bismarck, and Violet stood at his graveside with her children surrounding her, feeling hollowed out and lost. For 43 years, Xavier had been her partner, her love, her best friend, and she did not know how to exist without him. The months that followed were the hardest of Violet's life, harder even than those desperate days collecting buffalo bones. She went through the motions of living, but the joy had gone out of everything. Her children worried about her, tried to draw her out of her grief, but she felt like she was moving through a fog, disconnected from the world around her. It was her oldest grandson, Xavier's namesake, who finally broke through her sorrow. Young Xavier was 12 years old and serious beyond his years, and he came to visit her one afternoon with a request. He wanted to learn about ranching from her, wanted to know all the things his grandfather would have taught him. And in teaching him, in passing on Xavier's knowledge and values to this boy who carried his name, Violet found a way back to herself. She lived another 18 years, watching her grandchildren grow and marry and have children of their own. She saw the ranch continue to prosper under James's management, and then under young Xavier's when he came of age. She saw automobiles replace horses on the roads, saw electricity come to the rural areas, saw the world change in ways both wonderful and terrible. But through it all, she carried Xavier with her in her heart. She talked to him sometimes, when she was alone in the garden or sitting on the porch at sunset, telling him about the grandchildren's accomplishments, about the changes on the ranch, about how much she missed him. And sometimes, in the golden light of evening or the silver wash of moonlight, she could almost feel his presence, could almost hear his voice telling her he loved her. Violet Lawson Owens died peacefully in her sleep in July of 1945, at the age of 79. She was surrounded by family until the end, loved and cherished by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who knew her story and understood what she and Xavier had built together from nothing. She was buried beside Xavier in the cemetery outside Bismarck, and the headstone bore both their names and the dates of their long lives. But their real legacy was not in stone. It was in the ranch that still bore Xavier's name, now run by the fourth generation of the family. It was in the stories passed down from parents to children, tales of hardship overcome and love that endured. It was in the values of hard work and determination and loyalty that they had lived by and passed on to their descendants. And it was in the memory of that day on the prairie in 1883, when a young woman collecting buffalo bones to sell by the pound met a cowboy who saw her for who she truly was and offered her not just easier work, but a chance at love and a future beyond anything she had dared to dream. In that moment, two lives had changed forever, setting in motion a love story that would endure through the generations, a testament to the power of hope and courage, and the simple human need to connect with another soul. The buffalo bones that Violet had once collected were long gone, ground into fertilizer and scattered across distant fields. But what she and Xavier had built together lived on, as permanent and enduring as the prairie itself, a legacy of love that would never fade.